Hello, welcome to the 12th episode of Criminal Profiling, where we continue with David Fuller, who we talked about a couple of weeks ago when I put out a film. And David had killed 2 girls in the 1980s, got away with it for a long, long time, was arrested in 2020 when DNA caught up to him. That is when they searched his house and discovered like 14 million images and 4 million video clips of David having sexual relations with corpses in 2 different hospitals that he worked. I believe he was engaging in these acts over an 11 or 12 year period or something like that. The total number of corpses that we know about I believe are 102, and the youngest corpse was 9, the oldest was 100. They were all either girls or women. So for whatever reasons, and I'm not sure, I've not heard David's own take on this, he became attracted to corpse in such a way that he could engage in sexual acts with them. I did not go over the last film to refresh myself from 2 weeks ago, so I'm just kind of putting this out there. I do not know if we talked about his imagination that much, but thinking about it now, why is this guy going to a morgue, looking at a corpse, and then suddenly going, hey, I could do this, and suddenly find this a sexual possibility? There's something in the imagination, perhaps, but we'll come back to that. First, when you're dealing with corpses, because we're going to look at David, but we're also going to look at a number of people who have focused on corpses enough to warrant bringing them into this conversation and looking it up in their chart. Remember, it has to be very outstanding for us to be bothered with it when you're doing astrological criminal profiling. So the 2 planets we're going to be concerned with involving corpses are especially Saturn and Pluto. Saturn because it does rule death and can lead to morbidity, and depending on its positioning and aspects to other planets and so on. But also, and most prominent, is Pluto, because Pluto is the one planet that can go to those great depths of depravity that no other planet goes to. Insofar as signs, your major sign, of course, would be Scorpio, which deals with death, corpses, putrefaction, all of those sorts of things regarding death. And of course, its ruling planet is Pluto. So before we get into other people, let's just kind of take a quick look at David. What the heck is going on? This guy has no ongoing dealings with corpses per se. He's not a mortician or a mortician assistant. There was another guy I was hoping to get the chart of, but I can't so far. His name was Kenneth Douglas. He worked as a morgue assistant, and he raped about 100 corpses over 16 years. And he was married during that time as well. So that's a real shame. If anybody knows where we can get that birthday and place of birth for Kenneth Douglas, who worked in the morgue, please pass it on to me. I would love to make the comparison. So let's continue now with David Fuller. He becomes attracted to corpses for some reason. We see he has very little restraint when it comes to attractions because of Venus square Jupiter. And Jupiter is the planet of expansion. The 2 planets have no strength. They're both kind of weak. So it expands exponentially. And so he's a very untrustworthy kind of guy. He might be a very untrustworthy as a partner. Now, David was not very good looking, so I imagine he didn't have many offers coming his way and ended up with these corpses. And I think had he been better looking, those corpses would have never come into play. But let's continue. He's also got Venus conjunct Saturn. There's a bit of morbidity there. But bigger than that is Venus square Uranus, where he gets those really powerful attractions that can be unusual or unique, because it has no boundaries or laws set with it, because it's Uranus, the planet of chaos. So that can open doors too. He's also got Venus conjunct Neptune, where he brings in his photography, but it also brings in a little bit about his psychology. Remember, this guy collects millions and millions of images. He's right into photography and stuff, and he's turned this into a fantasy thing with Venus and Neptune being fantasy. Here he's having sexual fantasies, and he's involving himself with corpses. And we should also make the special note here that we have Venus in Libra, which is cerebral and mental. The mental attractions, it's very cerebral. And it's conjunct Saturn, which is in Scorpio. So there's a double death connotation there, right? Saturn ruling the death, Scorpio ruling also death, but in a deeper way, which can involve depravity of a very deep level, the deepest levels. So David has everything we need to set up this this idea of somebody who's not working with corpses every day and kind of getting used to them, but discovers them and becomes attracted and then fantasizes. He must fantasize because he's filming all these things. He's going through the motions. He's calling some of them best yet and so on and so forth. So here we have Venus square Jupiter for lack of discrimination and total openness and also abundance. These 12 million images. This is a large amount, and that's Jupiter playing its role and just going and going, never ending, just expanding. Venus square Jupiter. Venus conjunct Saturn in Scorpio brings us more into the idea of death and accepting death and possibly even being attracted, because Venus is the planet of attraction and it's conjunct Saturn in Scorpio, making everything seem okay because it's not agitated with a square or anything like that. Then he has Venus square Uranus for powerful, sudden, unusual attractions that can be unorthodox or totally chaotic, because Uranus is the planet of chaos and no laws. So there we have Venus in there, and these are all playing together, all of these aspects, and we're not done yet. Now we have Venus conjunct Neptune for that imagination, the photography, the films, and it's connected, of course, to Venus square Jupiter for the abundance of films. The death, the filming of corpses, the Venus conjunct Saturn in Scorpio. These are all very telling of what David is doing. And so they really support the case. Now, he also has Jupiter square Neptune, which is the planet of abundance, and that imagination just going wild with it's very expansive, with Jupiter being the planet of expansion, Neptune his imagination, right? Jupiter's also conjunct Uranus. So there again is that breaking down of barriers, no laws, no limits, with Uranus involved, right? With his philosophies, which is attached to his imagination, which is abundant because Jupiter is square Neptune. So it's also a bit distorted and perverted. Another combination we talked about a couple of weeks ago was the Moon square Pluto. Now we don't have his time of birth, but because the Moon is 29 degrees Scorpio, that we can assume that he was born in the daytime, but not too late into the evening, and that Moon square Pluto is likely active and fits his emotional mode of depravity and what he did with those corpses. Now let's take a look at some other people who have had dealings with corpses enough that it warrants looking it up in a chart. First up is Dennis Nilsson. If you're not familiar with Dennis Nilsson, there's a great documentary on Netflix right now. Keep in mind that as we go through these charts, that we're always looking for the same planets, sign, and house. Those are Saturn and Pluto, the sign Scorpio, or the 8th house. One of those should be outstanding in every single chart ahead of us. So were we working an actual case right now, the following list is a list of people I would have pulled from a pool of suspects, because they all fulfill certain criteria we're looking for, and that is excessive interaction with corpses. So we're looking for Saturn, Pluto, Scorpio, or the 8th house. Dennis Nilsson had sexual relations with many of the corpses. He has the Moon conjunct Saturn. He also has Jupiter square Saturn and Saturn square Ascendant. So there's a lot going on with Saturn there, and that's one of the planets we're looking out for. He also has Venus in Scorpio. Scorpio is the sign we're looking out for. Square to Pluto, one of the planets we're looking out for. So Venus in Scorpio, Venus being the planet of attractions in Scorpio, square to Pluto, which is the planet which also reflects the ability to go to the deepest levels of depravity. In regards to the 8th house, we find Mercury opposite Uranus in the 8th house. Up next, we have Earl Nelson, who murdered between 22 and 29 people. He has the Sun opposite Saturn, Mercury opposite Saturn, Jupiter square Saturn, as well as Saturn conjunct Uranus. And Saturn itself is in Scorpio, the sign we're looking out for. And we also have Uranus in Scorpio, now that we're talking about Scorpio. And we have the Sun opposite Uranus, Mercury opposite Uranus, and Jupiter square Uranus, which are both Saturn and Uranus in Scorpio. On top of this, we also have Mercury conjunct Pluto. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, slept with some of the corpses. He would return to the victim and sleep with the corpse if it was not too badly decomposed, or if there weren't too many insects or maggots on the corpse. In Gary's chart, we find the Sun opposite Saturn. We have Mars opposite Saturn. We have the Moon square Pluto, Mercury opposite Pluto, Venus opposite Pluto. The Moon is in Scorpio, and it is square to Mercury, square to Venus, and square to Pluto. In the 8th house, we have the Moon, which, as we just heard, was square to Mercury and Venus and square to Pluto as well. And also within the 8th house is Neptune, and we have Jupiter square Neptune. Both Gary and David Fuller share some similarities, such as Jupiter square Neptune, and they both have the Moon in Scorpio square Pluto in Leo. However, as an outstanding difference, if we were looking for David Fuller and we wanted to separate the two, David Fuller had shown very strong signs of risk-taking. And in his chart, we found Venus square Uranus, Uranus being the key planet in this case for that risk-taking. In Gary Ridgway's case, we find no outstanding aspects to Uranus that would reflect that sort of behavior. What we get is the Sun trine Uranus and Uranus trine Ascendant. Neither of those aspects would adequately reflect the behavior we're looking for in the risk-taking. Next up, we have George Waterfield Russell Jr., who murdered 3 women that we know of. The first one, he strangled and posed the body. The second one, the woman's head was bashed in, and there were bite marks, and the body was posed. In the third instance, the victim was stabbed, and then the skull was bashed in. There was a sex toy shoved down her throat. George would violate the corpses post-mortem. In George's case, we find Venus opposite Pluto in the 8th house. Were we separating suspects and we were looking for David Fuller and we had George's chart in front of us as well, and not knowing who is who, we could use George's MO as a way of separating the charts instead of using David Fuller's. For instance, we know in George's MO that he's very physically violent, and we know that David Fuller is not that violent physically, like a pugilist type violence. Now, I'm not counting the Plutonian type of violence, which is like disemboweling and stuff, which George kind of tended towards, by the way. But in this case, he's also got this pugilist thing going on. He smashed the skulls of 2 of his victims. So we could be looking out for Mars. And so what we've got is we've got one chart that shows Mars opposite Uranus. That would have been George's chart. We would have looked at David Fuller's chart and noted that he's got Sun trine Mars, Mars sextile Saturn. Not very violent at all. So George's chart is most likely the one with Mars opposite Uranus. We can put that one aside. In actual practice, you would hopefully have more than one thing to look for to separate the charts, instead of just going on, in this case, a bit of more physicality. Even though you would have been right and you would have separated the right guy, it's better to have 2 or 3 or 4 outstanding differences between those 2 people, and then find all of them. Next up, we have Jeffrey Dahmer, who had strange interactions with his corpses, though you probably already know all about his story, and there's mutilation involved and very deep levels of depravity. So, of course, we're going to be looking for Pluto for him. But, of course, we're looking for a person who deals a lot with corpses. So let's continue with that. And we've got Jeffrey Dahmer with the Moon square Saturn. He also has Saturn in conjunct Uranus, Saturn square Ascendant. So there are some outstanding things with Saturn. He also has Pluto, outstanding Pluto issues. He's got the Sun square Pluto, Mercury square Pluto. And of course, we all know that he gets very deep into the anatomy and the guts of animals, and that's where you're getting that from, them, especially the Mercury and the Sun square Pluto, right? For that scientist kind of bent to him. Jeffrey's 8th house is absolutely loaded. It has the Sun, Mercury, and Venus. And so all those aspects would have to be considered, such as the Sun in conjunct Jupiter and square Pluto, Mercury, who is in conjunct Neptune and square Pluto. We also have Venus, who is square Uranus. And that's a similarity with David Fuller, of course. They both have Venus square Uranus and have that risk-taking element to them. Whereas Jeffrey Dahmer, he hid himself in a department store after getting a sudden powerful attraction to a mannequin, and which had the abs and torso that he just loved. That was in his fantasies. So he hid inside the department store till they closed. Then he came out, grabbed the mannequin, undressed it, and then took it out and called a cab and went home with it. But that's the risk-taking they both share. If we were trying to separate these two men as suspects and we were looking for David Fuller, there's a lot of similarities between Jeffrey Dahmer and David Fuller. They have the outstanding imagination. They both have the risk-taking. They both steep to very deep levels of deprivation. So we can't really go by those things. So we would have to find something else. And one of the things you could look for, you should also look for more things than what I'm about to mention here. But one of the things is with Jeffrey Dahmer has more physicality than David Fuller. Even though he doesn't show it in his personalities when he's talking a lot, he seems very flat. That's more the moon square Saturn coming into play, things like that. But as so far as crimes, Jeffrey Dahmer fared fairly well in the army except for the alcoholism. And in his chart, you'll notice that there's a Mars squared Jupiter, which is an aspect seen in many soldiers, the charts of soldiers. So we might look at that. David Fuller, as we saw earlier, only has the Sun trine Mars, Mars sextile Saturn. So that's one of the things that we could use, among hopefully other things that we could use to separate these two men. The next chart up is that of Joachim George Kroll. Now, the MO for Joachim was stabbing, strangulation, sex with corpses, mutilation, and cannibalism. And so we're looking for a very, very deep level of depravity. And we get that with Joachim when we look at his chart. He has the Sun square Pluto as well as Venus square Pluto. So that is very reflective of what we were looking for right off the bat. Another aspect we would consider is Jupiter in conjunct Saturn. Now, if you were separating suspects and you had Joachim's chart and David Fuller's chart in front of you but didn't know which was which, you could use Joachim's MO of stabbing and being more physically violent as a way of separating the charts and finding which chart belongs to David Fuller, the chart you actually want. So in this case, you're looking for Mars because you're looking for the stabbing and the anger and the more physicality in that way. So it's not so much Pluto that you'll be looking for now. Now you're going for Mars. So in one chart, you would note Mercury in conjunct Mars. And in the other chart, you would note for the person, the Sun trine Mars and Mars sextile Saturn. So you would assume that the Mercury in conjunct Mars chart should be Joachim's, and you would separate that. Next up, we have the chart of John Christie, who became infamous from the 10 Rillington Place murders, where he gassed quite a few victims and would engage in sexual interactions with the victim, sometimes when unconscious, and oftentimes post-mortem. Looking at John's chart, we have the Moon likely square Saturn. We also have Saturn opposite Neptune. In regards to Pluto, we have Venus square Pluto and Saturn opposition Pluto. If we were separating charts as suspects and looking for David Fuller, we could also note that John again has more physicality than David Fuller, just as the people prior that we were talking about. John Christie was involved in both World War I and World War II. In John's chart, we find Mercury square Mars, whereas in David Fuller's, again, we only have the Sun trine Mars and Mars sextile Saturn. So again, the physicality in John Christie's chart sticks out. So we would choose that chart that had Mercury square Mars as a way to separate it away from David Fuller's. Both John Christie and David Fuller were risk takers, and both of them possess Venus square Uranus in their charts. Next up, we have Joseph Vatcher, who killed between 11 and 27 people. His MO included stabbing and shooting. He had 2 prior suicide attempts. His victims were 5 teenage girls, 5 teenage boys, and 1 woman. He disemboweled some of his victims, raped and sodomized the corpses. once again, we can see there's going to be some differences between Joseph Vatcher and David Fuller, and it's going to be that physicality again. But we'll pick this up next week. We've run out of time for our 20-minute show. Remember to download all the charts that we've talked about today from the link below, and you can continue on looking into Joseph Vatcher